Assalamu alaikum, good evening. Thank you for being here this evening. I am going to begin with a brief introduction to Dr. Amar Sohal. We're here to discuss his new book, The Muslim Secular, Parity and the Politics of India's Partition. Dr. Amar Sohal teaches at King's College, London. He's an intellectual historian of modern South Asia with a focus on anti-colonial nationalism, religious politics, and the secular state. He is interested in those ideas that continue to shape contemporary politics in both India and Pakistan. And as I said, today we're here to talk about his new book, The Muslim Secular. The book examines the political thought of three eminent Indian Muslim nationalists of the 20th century, people whose names we're all familiar with, but perhaps not so much their stories or their thought. And hopefully Amar will explain more about that. Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, Sheikh Abdullah, and Abdul Ghaffar Khan. So thank you so much for being with us today, Amar. And I am going to first ask you to reintroduce all of us to your three main characters.
Well, first of all, thank you, Aliya, for hosting this discussion, and to Yaqub Pangash, who I don't think is here, but very kindly invited me to the Afkar Taza. It's great to be here. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here and talking about my book, which has just come out in Pakistan. It's been out in India and in the UK and elsewhere for a bit longer now. So yeah, the book is on these three thinkers. I mean, Abul Kalam Azad, I think, is fairly well known among the three, I suppose. Although I think Abdul Ghaffar Khan won't be unknown at all in Pakistan. But Azad, of course, Jinnah's great rival during the politics of partition, I suppose. But he has a much wider career than that. You know, he's a Sunni theologian. He writes a commentary on the Quran. He's also an Urdu writer, a journalist in an earlier avatar. I mean, I really pick up the story in the 30s. So his journalistic days are more or less behind him by then. But he is India's education minister after partition and independence, Nehru's right-hand man for a decade of post-colonial government. So I think, and very much at the center of some of the, and often forgotten, but you know, very much at the center of the debates around partition, you know, with the cabinet mission in 1946. He's the president of the Congress from 1940 to 46. So he's very much, you know, he may be a man without a constituency in many ways, but he certainly, his stature within the Congress was great, well, in want of a better word, I suppose. Sheikh Abdullah, I think, will be known to many of you, and for some reason, I think these days is hated on both sides of the border and in his homeland of the Kashmir Valley. But I think an incredibly adept thinker around what it might have taken to be a federalist thinker in South Asia, a thinker of federation, a thinker of regional identity as being paramount, as being the locus, if you like, of post-colonial sovereignty in some sense, shared sovereignty, but nevertheless. And I think Sheikh Abdullah in that way poses like a vision to a different kind of South Asia, one where the region was the center of power, and in the end that is not what we've ended up with. We've ended up with two and then three fairly centralized states. Abdul Ghaffar Khan might be thought to provide a quite similar vision as well. But as you all know, Abdul Ghaffar Khan was very much an activist and a man of political action. And one has to essentially kind of excavate his ideas from his action. And that's what I've tried to do. But he is a believer in active nonviolence, as you know, and he theorizes that through Islam and through Pashtun Wali, the ethical code of the Pashtuns, famously. spends many years in prison in colonial India and in post-colonial Pakistan. Is sent into exile. But through and through a congressman in many ways, and he would probably argue the last one who stood by the Congress ideas. Whether we want to agree with him or not, we can debate that. But
Well, I grew up hearing of him always referred to as the frontier Gandhi. That's how he's famous. Amar, I wanted to take you from there into a conversation about these seemingly obvious but very meaning-laden and expansive concepts that are in the title of your book. How are you using and operationalizing the term secular? But with it, I think you also need to talk about parity, because it does play a role in how you have theorized the work of these thinkers.
yeah, absolutely, Ali. I think those are like some big questions. I'll try and break some of those down. I think the first thing to really think about is that the title is quite provocative. A lot of people would be surprised to see Muslim and secular put together to produce the concept of the Muslim secular. But I think I can explain that to you by saying that secularism, as it was theorized in India or South Asia through the colonial period and into the post-colonial period as well, but especially in the kind of the first half of the 20th century, secularism didn't necessarily mean the separation of church and state as it is imagined in Europe, right? Secularism in its modern form, and not just in South Asia, but especially in South Asia, where you're presented with such plurality, that is to say, so much difference, right? There's so much diversity within colonial India. There are multiple religions. How does one manage this multiplicity? What does one do with all of this? How do we make sure that the state of the future is a neutral one? And that really is what defines secularism on the one, at a kind of first principle, if you like, that the state will be neutral and it will remain, a kind of, to quote the political theorist Rajiv Bhargava, kind of keep a principled distance from its various religions, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and so on. But that's not all, because secularism also kind of named a vernacular sense of tolerance as well. So, अगर हम कहें कि हम secular है India में आज, a Maulvi can stand up and say he's secular, and a Pandit can stand up and say he's secular, which might sound bizarre, right? But it really means tolerance. It stands in for an idea of acceptance. And I think I was playing with that more than anything else. So it's possible to be a believing Muslim, as all the three figures that I look at were. वो सब मुसलमान थे, they believed in Islam, they were very committed to their religion, unlike their famous opponent, Qaid-e-Azam, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, right? Very, in that way, they were believing Muslims in the truest sense. And so their view of Islam was also one of universalism, that actually what mattered was not the unit of the faith group or the ethnic group or the nation, but rather the nation was, if you like, the penultimate form of human unity before, so in a sense, in the concept of insaniyat is at the center of their Islam, right? And that, in a way, lends itself to an alliance with other Indians in their vicinity.
So, Amar, all these figures, you yourself in the description of the book call them nationalists. It's a very different kind of nationalism, and as you said, they are staunchly Muslim. And in the book, you also argue that that at least Azad, more than others, stands for religious autonomy, right? He does believe that Muslims in their faith and as a community of faith need to be able to express and live, in an autonomous manner. And he believes that actually will happen if in the realm of politics and anti-colonial nationalism, he what do you call it? He stresses on a shared profane culture. And you're using the term profane, of course, in opposition to sacred. And so it is what, maybe we might call everyday culture, that Hindustan, and jisko hum Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb kehte hain, that there is so much commonality based on a historical argument, which I also found interesting, right? That he uses the shared history of living together and ideas such as Akbar Sulhe Kul to do what you're saying, what you are calling secularism. So tell us more about that. What did Azad do?
Yeah, of course. So I guess this kind of speaks to your earlier question, which I didn't answer, about parity, right? And so really important here is to understand that these figures believe that Muslims are not really a minority in colonial India. They're only a minority in name. Right? That is to say that for Abdullah and for Ghaffar Khan, it's quite obvious. Their homelands are overwhelmingly Muslim. Right? More than 9 in 10 Pashtuns are Muslims. More than 9 in 10 Kashmiris are Muslims. So the idea that they can be, and Abdul Ghaffar Khan says as much, and it's a quote from him from 1947, the idea that we can be dominated by outsiders is, unimaginable to me. He says something along those lines. That is one thing for them. But for Azad, it's a different situation, because he is somebody who's not really located in any particular geography. That is to say, he doesn't have a province or a city that he's particularly identified with. He has Delhi and Calcutta, of course, but really he kind of sets aside the regional and owns the national, and wants to represent Muslims and Indians more generally at the national level. And at that level, Muslims are a minority, quite clearly. So he has to play around with other ways of kind of averting this status of being a minority. And the way to do this is to go back into history and say, well, you can't imagine an Indian story or an Indian history or an Indian culture or Indian society without the Muslim element. That is to say that despite the difference in numbers between these two communities, Muslims have parity with Hindus because their value or their influence is integral, right? When you remove one element, India doesn't stand up, right? So you remove the Hindus, there'll be no India left. Though you remove the Muslims, similarly, there'll be no India left, or what we understand India to be, right? And so this is might sound very romantic, but it's also, in his view, quite pragmatic and realistic. That's to say that, he even says so in 1940, whether you like it or not, you're a nation. You don't have any choice. History has made you a nation. Your languages are the same, your customs are the same, your religions are different, of course, and there must be autonomy, as Aliya rightly said, for Islam. There has to be personal law, it's to be enshrined in the constitution, it is to be guaranteed by the new state, and so on. But above and beyond that, or beyond religion, there is plenty of space for a shared world, which is, you could say profane.
You also have a concept, I'm going to bring in your other two figures now, of a third kind of nationalism. We're all very familiar with religious nationalism and the two-nation theory. We're sitting in a Pakistani forum. But Sheikh Abdullah and Abdul Ghaffar Khan are also seeking to protect what you call ethnic particularity.
Yeah, the subcontinent is a very diverse place of many ethnicities, or what are understood to be ethnicities, or linguistic groups. These themselves are, of course, colonial terminologies, right, which have been, in a sense, appropriated by these nationalists, or they've kind of swallowed some of these ideas, colonial ideas, wholesale. And in a way, what I think is interesting is that the reason why they can form alliances with the Congress, the Khudai Khidmatkars in the frontier, or today's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or for that matter, the National Conference in Kashmir, the reason they're able to do this so easily is because they anchor Islam religious culture, religion in the region, right? They say that Kashmiri-ness or Pashtun-ness is defined not entirely, but significantly by its Muslim element, right? So Islam and the regional identity are linked together, they're fused together. So in the valley, the shrines of the valley are extremely important to Abdullah's politics. For Abdul Ghaffar Khan, he theorizes non-violence through Pashtunwali, right? And ideas of forgiveness and bravery, but he's also using Islamic concepts of sabr, for instance, and many others, right? So they're fusing these things together. And that means that they can make the regional space fairly religious, and it anchors Islam there. And then when you come to the national level, you've already solved the problem, as it were, of Muslim self-statement in a minority context, right? You anchor it in that place, and then you can afford a negotiation or an alliance with a Hindu majority Congress, right? You can become part of that because you've settled that question. And of course, this relies partly on a kind of federal form of government, but I think there's more to it than just that. But it's that which allows for these alliances to take place, and there's a common sense here that this is not to say that in places like Punjab and Bengal, non-league alternatives or nationalist alternatives didn't exist. But because Muslims are overwhelmingly in a majority in these places, there's a common sense to these ideas kind of emerging in their thickest form, in their deepest and most significant intellectually, in such a meaningful way, that the fact that they are formed in these heavily Muslim contexts has a common sense of its own.
So another word you use a lot in the book, and we all know it, we understand it, that all of these nationalists or anti-colonial activists are concerned with the prospect of minoritization, right? अंग्रेज चले जाएंगे, हिंदू majority रह जाएगी और Muslim minority रह जाएगी, फिर क्या होगा? And everybody has a somewhat different solution to this looming problem. So if you were to encapsulate, in a short statement, what the difference is between the way the Congress Muslims like Azad and Abdul Ghaffar Khan seek to solve the problem of minoritization versus how the Muslim League sought to deal with it, what would you say?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's quite clear that for Jinnah and the Muslim League, principally what's at stake here is not questions of culture, right? They're not questions of society in the way that interests the figures that I was looking at. For Jinnah, what matters most is legal representation of Muslims in post-colonial India, whether that's a united state, multiple states. And so what matters most of all is the doing away of what he thinks is the disempowering status of minority and empowering the Muslims in some sense. And ultimately he calls them a nation. And in the post League of Nations world, the League of Nations, of course, as you know, in Europe, decided to protect minorities. That collapses with the onset of the Second World War. So that whole logic is thrown out of the window. And you are left now with nations being the kind of logical next step for minorities. Minorities are now going to become nations. And that's where partitions come from, right? You partition in order to create nations, in order to give sovereignty to nations, to new minority nations. Now, that is the logic of partition. It doesn't just happen here, it happens in Ireland before, it happens fatefully in Palestine, and in many other places. But I mean, I was really interested in looking at thinkers who kind of bucked that trend and said, well, the minority can actually belong with the existing majority. And that project requires a certain confidence. Right? It requires the view, it has to take the view that the minority, in fact, is not disempowered. In fact, it's not weak. The word minority doesn't necessarily have to translate into weakness. And so For these figures, there are two things here. Particularly important is that this isn't really a minority. It has majority provinces. It has a huge population, and Azad is famous for this. कि, you know, तादाद इतनी है, तो how can we be a minority? This is bizarre. हमारे 5 सूबे हैं, ये हम minority कैसे हो सकते हैं? Right? So this kind of logic. And so there's that on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's a kind of social element to this, that they all understand Indian society, or colonial Indian society.
So there's a hum of conversation coming from the back, and I'm wearing a hearing aid, and I'm finding it grossly disturbing. So people who are having conversations at the back, please barai mein dabani apni guftagoo kar.
Keep quiet.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, so the thank you, Nasreen. The second point that I wanted to make was that there's a social element to this minoritization question, right? If you create a Pakistan or you partition colonial India, according to these figures, according to Azad, Abdullah, and Ghaffar Khan, and they all say it in different ways, you will institutionalize enmity in the subcontinent. That is to say that India's history has been one in which Hindus and Muslims have shared many positive things, but they've also shared many negative things, right? Both of these things exist. Amity on the one hand and enmity on the other. This is not a romantic nationalism at all, right? This is to actually say that if you institutionalize division, well, then you will do away with the amity. The enmity will become institutionalized, and these two states will be locked in battle with each other forever.
And that turned out to be prescient. Yeah.
Well, who knows, right? We'll stick to the history. But nevertheless, that was the argument. Of course, for Jinnah, it was the opposite. Jinnah's was a different view. He saw partition as an optimistic idea, that actually you partition, you give sovereignty to both of these communities, you agree to protect these minorities in both places, and you get on with you go along the road of democracy and friendship and so on like that. So that was the vision. But in a sense, you might argue that that didn't happen.
That's interesting. Of course, so you're saying that actually, in a way, they were both sides were arguing for amity over enmity, but with different solutions. There is also a really interesting section in your book in which you quote Jinnah in 1947, emphasizing that the Muslim League that would be left in post-partition India must continue to exist to represent Muslim minority rights in India. And then it seems that it is Azad who is responsible for dismantling that All India Muslim League. And so we end up in a situation where the Muslim minority does not have a national political platform to protect its rights as a minority.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I end the book more or less with that. And I think, it's very difficult in partitioned India to argue for a Muslim political party. You have created a Muslim political party in order to protect the rights and interests of the minority. That party, with a long history of trying to do that within a single state, decides to opt for a separate state, then how then does that same party function in that half of the country which is now left, right? It becomes very difficult to make that argument. So Nehru, Patel, Azad used this as an opportunity to cut what they would call communal politics to size, right? That actually now you embrace secular forms of organization, and secular in the other sense of the word, not in the sense that I'm using it necessarily, but in the sense that political representation, right, will be entirely based on your economic interests, not based on your religious identity. And your religious identity will be preserved or protected by the constitution, but that is it, right? You now get represented on the basis of other things. And it becomes very difficult to make the argument for reservations and quotas and so on. And these are the debates in the Constituent Assembly of India and in Pakistan, for that matter. But Pakistan, of course, does concede some of that within, in the Pakistan Constituent Assembly debates. But it's a different logic that's playing out there. This is now a Muslim state, or a Muslim majority state made for Muslims, so it has to protect its minorities. Whereas in India, the logic is that no, this state was always for everybody. Now you can't have something special, right? Now, whatever you might think of that, that might be something that convinces you, it may be something that doesn't convince you, but it's very difficult to argue for Muslim representation in a country which has been partitioned because of Muslim representation. So Sardar Patel, who is, often accused of being a kind of Hindu nationalist, which I don't think he necessarily is. He's certainly not Savarkar. Shruti Kapila has written beautifully on Patel as a kind of, harder element within the Congress and different from Savarkar and the Mahasabha, and she nuances that very well. But she kind of says that, Patel's asking for a decision. These are now two sovereign states. You're either from here or you're from there. You decide now. अगर आपको यही चाहिए मुस्लिम वाली पॉलिटिक्स तो फिर आप पाकिस्तान चले जाइए. अगर आपको सेक्युलर पॉलिटिक्स चाहिए, ना हिंदू ना मुसलमान, yeah, then it's fine. You can stay here. So there's that important difference that.
You've come to something I wanted to ask you, and it'll carry on organically from here. We're all familiar with how quickly and somewhat unexpectedly the nature of the partitioned states took shape, and it was a ground reality in that historical moment that forced. People and all these people that we are talking about to recalibrate, right, what they were thinking and advocating for. And that is also something you cover in your book, right? Azad changes or direction, or seems to change direction a bit, although his goal remains the same. Sheikh Abdullah has a very interesting trajectory after partition. So can you talk more about that?
Yeah, of course. I think for Sheikh Abdullah, why is the anti-colonial movement the kind of center of political thought, or the kind of crucible of political thought in South Asia? It is because it's possible to imagine a vision or imagine a future which is free, right? So all manner of theorization can take place. You can imagine the future India however you want. And so at that moment, in the 30s and 40s, at the beginning of Abdullah's career, he's able to imagine a federal, decentralized India, or what I've called the three-nation theory, right? That is to say that Kashmir is its own nation, right? India is also a nation of which Kashmir is a part, and in between you have Jammu and Kashmir, right? Which has become this accidental nation, right? It's been put together, and these people have been bundled into a Dogra princely state, and therefore they've become a nation because you know what? They need socialism, right? So they now need a civic nationality of their own, right? So, but these nations are compatible. This is not a three-nation theory of separation, but rather it's like almost like a wedding cake, if you like, with a base and then layers on top of it. Right? Once you have independence and partition, the context changes entirely. You have centralized rule in these states. And therefore, the question arises, well, how do you now fold this decentralized idea into a centralized context? You can't. And that's what produces the debate between Abdullah and Nehru, famously. Their visions of India are not compatible. And I suppose in many ways we're seeing the after effects of that. But of different visions of a future clashing in that very future.
We'll take a little turn now. Something I also enjoyed reading in your book is, of course, it must be said, I think we've been saying it again and again, but I make a point to say it, that a big part of the project is that you've taken active political leaders and treated them as political philosophers, as thinkers. So that in itself is an interesting project. And in doing so, because this is a work of intellectual history, you have also looked at the wider intellectual history of their moment, of their context, and you have written extensively on poets in particular, who are also engaging with this idea of the shared culture, and actually not necessarily profane when you come to the works of the poets, right? Because you have Kefi Azmi and Hazrat Mohani engaging with Hindu religious figures and ideas, and you have जोश मलिहाबादी's famous line, क्या सिर्फ मुसलमानों के प्यारे हैं हुसैन, right? Where he's trying to say that this is a story about oppression and tyranny that is universal, right, and human, and can bring us all together, and has done so. So why did you choose to incorporate these poets?
Yeah, wow. So 2 points. The first, I'll just touch a little bit on the method that which you began with, the anti-colonial figures, or these are politicians, right?
Yeah.
So these are political leaders. You will know about them. You will know about Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah, Azad, Abdullah, Savarkar. You know about all these figures as leaders. The project of political thought or intellectual history is to take them seriously as ideators, right? The thinkers of ideas, visions of the future that I just described. Because I think far too often we have reduced these people to cynics who are out to defend their interests and manipulate their way into power, right? Or a more, kind of charitable view would be that they protect their constituents, right? And all of that is true, right, to some extent. But there's much more to it than that. It's not enough to say that Jinnah was only interested in protecting his Muslim constituents. He had a certain idea of what the law was meant to do. He had a certain idea of what democracy was meant to be. And you can agree or disagree with it, but you have to take him on his own terms and present that idea properly. So that was what I was trying to do with these figures. And I think it's extremely important to say that, because I think that is often left out of the conversation, right? And a lot of history writing has been written like that, unfortunately. And I think, you heard from Vanya Bhargav yesterday, and I think, we're trying to, in a sense, of course, we're not the only ones doing it. There have been people like Faisal Devji and Shruti Kapila before us who've already done this work, but it's still a young and nascent project. So to return to your other question about poets, I just thought I wanted to show the kind of purchase of these ideas, or the kind of spread of these views beyond just politicians or leaders, right? I wanted to show that this idea of Hindu and Muslim fusing together, or a certain idea of culture which extends beyond religion, for that matter, goes beyond just, it traverses the boundary of politics, right? It seeps into our everyday life. And Azad says as much, right? He says that you need to look at your everyday life to understand that you are not separate nations. Yes, you are differently religious, that is true, but that doesn't mean you are separate nations. Just look around you. And so he never kind of writes a very long text like Nehru does to convince us of this. He doesn't write Discovery of India. He just thinks that you can slowly, jolt Hindus and Muslims into returning to that consciousness of their sharedness, even if they have been divided in other ways. Even if they have prejudices, you have to remind them what they share. They'll remember it themselves. And so he just, reels off lists. And so I wanted to show that in a bit more depth. And so that's why I went to Josh Malihabadi, and I went to Bridge Narayan Chakbast, some well-known, some less well-known. And then I went to some of the other progressives who actually use religious themes, because of course, for Azad, religion is where there's a line, right? He's a committed Maulana, right? He will engage with Hinduism on its own terms as a religious philosophy, even as a theology, right? But the idea of syncretism doesn't appeal to him. He doesn't want to be syncretic. That is to say, he's not interested in shared shrine practices, for instance. Whereas for the progressives, who are basically atheistic thinkers and uninterested in religion, for them, there's much more creativity to be done with religion. Or for that matter, a Sufi thinker like Hasrat Mohani, right? Who can turn Christian, into a kind of Beer type figure, right? And kind of appropriate him for his lineage, for his silsila, which is quite incredible. So there are these other ways of doing it. What I wanted to show that too. It's not just Azad's way, where you divide in almost in an artificial kind of way between so-called profane and so-called religious. There are these boundaries that get blurred. Of course, Azad is very, he's not interested in that at all, and there are obvious reasons why.
Yeah, the poetic literary tradition is really where the continuity comes from of this idea, even when they go back in history to provide proof rather than justification for a shared culture. This is where it resides. So that's why I thought it was powerful to bring in the poets. I'm going to open it up after one more question. There is another poignant and intriguing thought that you come to towards the end of your arguments, this concept of a productive engagement with loss. What do you mean by that?
Okay, it's a good question. I think what I was getting at was the idea that if you think about the history of the subcontinent, especially in the early modern period, you think of quote-unquote Muslim rule, right? And there is a great fascination with this idea in Indian political thought in the colonial period, right? After 1857 and onwards, that Muslims have ruled the subcontinent, and therefore they have a stake in its political power. And so this project, if you want to now become part of an Indian republic, an Indian democracy, which is what these figures want to do, a federal Indian democracy, albeit, you have to some extent, get rid of these myths of rulership, right? Instead, these are turned around into influences on society at large. The importance of Islam and the importance of Indian culture and the contribution to it, rather than rulership, right? So even the Mughals are turned into patrons of culture. They're not exemplars for political rule in the future. That is not what, so they're kind of depoliticized and culturalized as figures. That's what Azad and people around him, who some of you may have heard of, like Humayun Kabir and Sayyid Mahmud.
Actually, can you talk a little bit more about Humayun Kabir?
The education minister in India after Azad, he was a great intellectual Bengali, but well-versed in Urdu as well as Bengali and English. He went to Oxford, and he really wrote. I mean, I didn't even manage to get through all his material because there's so much of it.
You quote extensively from him, maybe more than anybody else, actually.
Yeah, because I think in a way he, unlike Azad, who's occupied in the rough and tumble of real politics, Humayun Kabir can sit and theorize more deeply. So in a sense, he can kind of fill in the gaps for Azad, if you like, So yeah. So one element of this so-called compact with loss is to do away with this idea of rulership, right? But there's a second element to this, which is that for Pashtuns and for Kashmiris, but especially for Pashtuns, they have an idea of their own rulership of themselves, right? They have this inherited meta-commentary, mythology, whatever you want to call it, which they've internalized, that we will rule ourselves, right? And by the code of Pashtunwali, right? So Abdul Ghaffar Khan has to work overtime to kind of rationalize the idea that they can have this within an Indian whole, right? So that also requires some form of sacrifice, if you like. But this is not sacrifice from a point of weakness. That's very important. Rather, these are very minimal sacrifices for a community, remember, that is very strong, right? So this dissolving of absolute sovereignty, or Muslim absolute sovereignty, into an Indian democracy is going to be beneficial because it's going to do away with the animosity that will be institutionalized and so on. So the cost-benefit analysis basically works in favor of the Congress project. But that is what these figures want to argue. I want to, yeah.
Thank you, Amar. Do we have a mic for the audience, guys? Open it first in front to Dr. Nasreen Rahman.
Hi, Amar and Aliya. What a very interesting discussion. And I must confess that I have not read your book and can't wait to read it. But particularly because of the very interesting questions that Aliya has asked you and how you've answered them. But I want to, so at the moment, there are 100 questions that I want to ask you, but I'll ask just one. And that's on secularism in the title. And because I am quite engaged in my own work and my life in England, not in India, or in Pakistan, on the question of secularism. So, of course, there is in Islam a very basic idea of deen or dunya. And Muslims, a lot of Muslims would argue that we don't need secularism, because there isn't a division in religion and everyday life. Our religion says that we have to take our everyday life with us, and within that, there is space for all religions to be incorporated and treated as with a human attitude. So that's a very strong message that is coming in Islam through the mystics, through the Sufis, etc. So within that, now we're talking about nationalism and the states, and these thinkers who are thinking of the state. So we've touched upon Pakistan, of course, but let's go to India. When the debates are taking place on the constitution, and here is a group, including Maulana Azad, who are saying that we wish to be secular, okay? This is a country where we will keep an arm's length between religion and politics. Yet, in the first Congress government, so we have a whole batch of the Hindu Mahasabha sitting in the Congress. I'm now posing the objections that some Muslims in India have raised. Then what you do is, you're a secular constitution, but what you do is that in that secular constitution, a large chunk of your population is minoritized, and minoritized on the basis of religion. So you are a secular country, as is Britain, but now in Britain they're talking about minorities, and a lot of those minorities are being labeled in their religious terms. And what I'm saying to them is, be careful, don't do that, because if you do that, you'll end up where India has ended, okay? You then become majoritarian. And of course, the favorites in England are the church, who love this idea of minoritizing the minorities and labeling them as narrowly as they can. So, do you think that your thinkers, because the three that you've named, and Maulana, although you didn't, refer to him in the same way as you referred to Ghaffar Khan or Sheikh Abdullah, Kashmiri and Pashtun, Maulana has grown up in a heavily Muslim majority province of Bengal, and which has a very rich history, even with people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, etc., of actually being a Muslim, and with Persian and so on, very deeply immersed in Bengali culture. So what do you think? Do you think that they didn't see that when India becomes one, and a unified India, and we won't talk about the princely states now, okay? So because that becomes too complicated, huh? So do you think that in their thinking, they did not see the problems of majoritarianism, and don't forget, in fact, that the more radical Muslims in India didn't want partition, because they were saying, the Muslim ulama were saying, don't partition, because you will weaken the ummah for different reasons, okay? They were not saying don't partition because of why Maulana Azad was saying or what Ghaffar Khan was saying. So do you think that they didn't see the future properly?
Oh, that's a huge question. I think their idea rests on a united India. That is to say that they believe that the Muslim minority is strong enough and the Hindu majority is not so overbearing in a united India that these two forces will offset each other. So they believe, therefore, that within a republican constitution, that in itself won't be enough. Rather, the sheer size of this community will act as a bulwark. That logic ends with partition. And so once thrown into that context, it becomes almost, again, experimentation begins. So Azad's experimentation starts by saying, okay, let's secularize politics entirely. Of course, you're right to say that there are Mahasabha elements in the Congress and all of that. And that's, in a way, part of the reason why I did this project. I wanted to pluralize what the Congress was. But of course, down the line, of course, Azad dies in 58, but Sheikh Abdullah lives much longer. And in 71, I think it is, he writes in the Indian Express, and I think he's in a period where he's out of jail. And he says, well, now is the time to rethink politics. Actually, maybe we do need a Muslim politics again, because this is a different kind of minority. And it's a minority that actually needs to ally with Dalits, so-called untouchables or previously untouchables, right? So Dalit Muslim politics is something that should emerge. And in a sense, he's, ahead of his times in a way, right? Because Dalit Muslim politics does emerge, but in a later period. And it hasn't fully emerged, one might say. But nevertheless, it's part of the logic of Indian democracy today, whether it'll happen or not, right? So there's a constant question.
Exactly. As I had said earlier, nobody expected partition to take the shape, or independence to take the shape that it did with partition. So how could you anticipate the kind of majoritarianism that happened? We have a question here.
Hello, Amar. It's good to see you around. And my question is that, isn't it ironic that the party that got India its freedom is the new punching bag? Like, everyone in India is making them an enemy. Secondly, Bacha Khan is almost forgotten. And that's ironic for people like us from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, that this man should be celebrated. Without him, the Congress is not complete. Kindly answer that question.
But tell me something. Is he forgotten for you, or is he celebrated by you?
Madam, we love him.
Yeah, exactly.
And non-violence is the way.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, Congress has a great challenge, I suppose, presented to itself politically, which I will not go into.
No, but historically.
But
right?
I think, what I will say to that question is, there are many legacies of partition. Is India a Hindu country? Is India secular country? Is Pakistan a Muslim country? Or is there space for minorities in Pakistan? These are all legacies of partition, right? Now, part of that legacy then is that Hindu nationalism begins to stake a claim, right? Through within the Congress and outside of the Congress. The Congress is a broad church, right? Not everyone agrees with Nehru, for instance. Now, one of the legacies of partition is the project becomes, without wishing to absolve other factors, it becomes easier for the Hindu nationalists to make an argument for a Hindu state in India, right? If you have a Muslim state here, right? That is one thing. And the second thing is, numerically, it makes it more possible, right? So that doesn't really answer your question, but it's a point worth thinking about. That is not to say that the Congress, you're right to say what you said. On Badshah Khan or Abdul Ghaffar Khan or Badshah Khan, however you want to call him, I think one thing I would really like to say to this audience especially is that Abdul Ghaffar Khan is not against Pakistan, okay? He is against the idea of partition, and he's against the idea of breaking a united India. But once it is broken, he says, okay, I disagreed with this, but I will now fight for a different type of Pakistan. A Pakistan in which ethnic groups, or so-called, or linguistic groups, will have their rights. This will be a federal country. This will be a secular country. And he thinks that Jinnah's initial statements would push Pakistan in that direction. So he gets behind that project. And what's incredible about Abdul Ghaffar Khan is he's a presentist thinker. What I mean by that is, in India, right, it wasn't possible in colonial times to link the Pashtuns with the rest of India on the basis of history. Because, of course, history could tie Pashtuns to India, of course, right, in many different ways. But it could also tie them to the kingdom of Afghanistan, right? Now, so history is a non-starter in a way. It kind of locks you in this position, whether, you know, history is not decisive, right? History can tie Indian Pashtuns to Afghanistan as much as they can tie, as much as they can be tied to the rest of India. Now, so that's one thing. So you've got to think about a civic unity that can bind the people of this colonial country, right? And the way to do that is through non-violence, civic understandings of what a republic might mean, what democracy might mean, and so on. So it is non-violent political action which creates the new India, which creates the Indian nation for the Pashtuns. So once, in a way, once partition happens, it's quite easy to transfer that civic presentist logic onto Pakistan and imagine Pakistan again. It's not reliant on history. And of course, Pakistan wants to do away with history anyway. That is Jinnah's project. Because history, of course, ties Hindus and Muslims together. That's Faisal Devji's argument, right? That history, it's not entirely cynical. It's to say that history can only bring Hindus and Muslims together, even if they want to fight with each other in that history. It makes them a nation, right? So let's not talk about that too much. Let's focus on the law. Let's focus on the constitution. That will produce equality today, right? So in a way, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, of course, refused Pakistan, but it was possible for him to reimagine it. And so if you take anything away from what I've written on him, I think it's that he can his thought can be excavated to produce, in Osama's words, a kind of non-violent Pakistan. And of course, there's a legacy for India too, and there's a legacy for Afghanistan as well in his thinking, and for everybody. It's a universalist idea, but it's worth thinking about that.
My question to you is linked to Ghaffar Khan, but I'm taking it forward now. Yeah, so once you say partition has been made, Ghaffar Khan said, yes, let's move on, Pakistan has been made, right? And Jinnah, Ghaffar Khan was secular. Do you think Jinnah wanted a secular Pakistan?
That's $1 million question, I think. I mean,
because that's what it happened, right? You just said it. Partition happened, nobody wanted it, but it happened. Once it happened, did he want secular Pakistan? That's a question that I would like your thoughts on, and you could be open about it. I mean,
the archive would suggest that for the longest time that was the case, right? That Pakistan was never imagined to be an Islamic state, right? But and you have the famous, people for this argument, people will quote the August 11th, 1947 speech. But Jinnah goes to Dhaka in March 1948, and this is Farzana Sheikh always reminds me of this whenever I want to make the argument that Jinnah is making a secular argument, that actually he goes to Dhaka in 1948 and says, well, this will now be a state run by the Shariat. So it's unclear as to whether he had a vision for Pakistan once it's... I'm not to say that he doesn't have a vision, he does, but are there conflicting visions? I think the way to understand this is that there's a secular democratic common sense to his politics right the way through, but he has to then deal with the problem that he has led a movement which has multiple visions of itself within it. And then it's a question of what do you now do with those multiple visions? I mean, I don't have an answer for you, to be honest. I will just present it as a problem.
Thank you very much for the fruitful discussion that you guys are doing. My question is, I'm here. Enough can be said about whatever can be the outcomes 70 years back, if the partition was good or the United India was good. But if we talk about in terms of today's time, contemporary times, and the vision and the ideas of those leaders, even I can include Jinnah, Nehru Sahab, and Gandhi also in this. My question is two-pronged. First of all, why the idea that these leaders proposed, why this idea did not get triumphant after 70, 80 years, why the other idea that we are going seeing, why it is triumphant, and both India and Pakistan, why the idea of secularism or the national identity and unity, ये क्यों कामयाब नहीं हो सका और हम दूसरा आइडिया क्यों कामयाब हो गया? And the other question is, is there any way that we can go back to that secularism state, or we are continuously diverging away from that point, from point zero, and we have gone so far that almost it has, in my humble opinion, we have crossed the point of no return, I guess. It's very difficult now to get back to those, even to that condition where we were after, before 70, 80 years when the partition happened. So can we go back to that, or now, in your opinion, after 50 years, it is going to get worse, or there is a chance that there is a little hope or any joy that we can get the ideal principle or the dream that these leaders had in 70, 80 years, even if all those leaders include Jinnah, Gandhi, Nehru, they got woken up even today from their graves. I can tell you that they will be shocked to see both the state of India and Pakistan, that what they have imagined and where the India and Pakistan are standing right now. They would like to go back to the grave, I guess. It will be a better option for them. So in your opinion, if you can argue, give your comments.
I'm going to just stick to history of political thought and say that I can't predict the future, but what I will say is that this work that we've done, right? There are many of us trying to do the history of political thought for South Asia, is to kind of excavate visions of a future, whether that be Gandhi, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, any of the figures that we've discussed, and present them as alternative political theories, right? Now, they are located in their context, but that doesn't mean that they're locked in there forever, right? It is for you all to think about which of those ideas you want to excavate, right? I'm not a citizen of India or Pakistan, right? So that project is yours. And I had the same questions when I spoke in India in March. But I think, I hope that this will produce a kind of reflection about what is democracy, what is nationality, what is the position of the minority, what is regional identity, what is linguistic identity. That in itself is, I think, a step forward. And then, uske baad, aapke haathon mein hai, bhai sahab.
Where is the mic?
Thank you so much, Amar, for being here. Hi, here. So I'm Ali. And I just wanted to ask that now I'm a Gen Z kid. Pakistan was made in 1947. And we are going through an era of globalization where the world is going borderless. And, we're still stuck in this, very huge intolerance. Everything, this mall road, it's closed all the time because of some people are getting out and being raging all around. But I wanted to ask, what would your leaders think about promoting secularism in Pakistan right now? And it's been 70 years and we can't do that. So what would your leaders think that?
No, I think that's very interesting because Abdul Ghaffar Khan basically realizes a partition, and he posits the idea of a secular Pakistan, realizes this is not really holding after Jinnah's death, especially. And so he kind of, in a way, secularism is a non-starter today in Pakistan, right? It has to be something else. It can be a kind of, to go back to Nasreen's question, that actually secularism here is a very light concept. Cécile Laborde, the political theorist, French political theorist at Oxford, says that secularism is basically a consideration everywhere in the world where there is religious plurality. It's just simply that. It's that what do you do with a state, a nation state? We're in the world of nation states. We're in the age of nation states. Where there is plurality, the question of whether the state is secular or not is a question for everybody, right? So it's not. You mustn't equate the lack of religion with secularism. It's a question of pluralism, right? And so I think you can reframe this. You don't have to use the word secular. In its time, these figures were using that word, right? Especially after 47, all three of them kept using it for a brief period, at least. And so I probably want to be provocative or whatever, but nevertheless, I think you can reframe this. You can use Islamic universalism. You can use the idea of insaniyat, which I begin the introduction with that. That Islam doesn't believe in breaking people down by race. That Islam believes in the human race. That is what Azad begins with. And usse hi secularism banta hai. And that might sound a contradiction in terms, but it's not, right? So I leave it. So you can be creative with that. You can, as Nasreen rightly said, built into an Islamic universalism in the subcontinent, predating this whole debate, predating this whole history, is an idea. Bulisha, padiye.
In the land of Bulisha.
There you go.
We have one last question we can take at the back.
Good evening. Can you hear me? To operate this.
Yeah,
Okay.
now it's working.
Okay. I'm going to try and word my question carefully. I know that this is about a specific subject or topic area, so to say. But could you shed some light on contextualizing our growth, our trajectory, our political trajectory, in the light of a post-colonial state, and compare it, with some examples of other post-colonial states that have gone or are going through, and there are some examples that come to my mind as well, but that are going through, have gone through a similar trajectory of state building, nation building, and the cross currents between these two themes that we see here in our polity. Could you take this forward and sort of, so that we can, as Pakistanis, I think it's very important, we're very critical of our own trajectory, which is fine, which I think everybody has a right to look upon our trajectory in a manner that they wish to see it as. But is it not part of a political development process as a post-colonial state that others are also experiencing or have experienced, and so that we can contextualize our current position and try and look into the future from that pedestal, if you would, please. Did I make some sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's a huge task. We probably need like a whole seminar where we all discuss this together, right?
India and Israel.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think, it's interesting because I was going to raise the point very quickly then, yeah. I was going to raise the point about the Palestine question, because essentially when you create a theocratic state, or not a theocratic state, but a state on the basis of religion, a religious state, or a state for a religious minority, then you pose a lot of questions about inheritance to your geography. Who belongs to this land? Does an inherited culture matter in that land or not? Can those from outside belong to that land or not? Do they belong to the land or do they belong to the state? Are they citizens or are they inheritors? These are all questions which I think the project of Israel and the project of Pakistan produce. That is to say, that is not to equate them morally in today's world, but that is to say that they are part of the same logic. And this is not my argument, this is my supervisor's argument, Faisal Devji, that essentially when you do away with history and create a religious state, you have to do away with you have to in a sense refashion an idea. And I think actually the problem with maybe you will live here, so it's not. I don't want to come here and lecture to you, but the question that I would pose to you is reckoning with your past, both Islamic and non-Islamic, will produce a confident idea of a kind of South Asian located Pakistan. I think Farzana Sheikh has written beautifully about this in the epilogue of her book, Making Sense of Pakistan. And I think that is what the post-colonial problem here and in Palestine to some extent is as well, although this is flattening of some description, but nevertheless. It's also true that we're 75, 80 years down the line, and that might sound like a lot of time, but maybe it is not as well. India's problems are different. They're because their inheritance, is people are competing about what this inheritance is, but there's no denying that it exists. I hope that makes some sense.
I think they are denying that it exists.
Well, they're denying that certain parts of it. Some people are denying that certain parts of it exist.
Denying it's a great project of revisionist history.
Yeah, of course there is.
We are out of time, and this is a conversation that could go on for at least another hour, but it is the last session of the evening, and people can continue to talk to Amar Sohal outside also. Thank you, Amar, for being here. Thank you all for being a great audience.